Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's change gears here. I want to talk a little bit about Brexit here. Glenn, you know, we're not in the UK, all right? We're not suffering the purgatory, as I mentioned in my introduction now, of the Brexit phenomenon here. But for two people, you and I, sitting in the studio here, looking afar, it seems to me that really what has happened is just a leadership failure by the political class. Because I'm sure in the UK you can blame the Remainders and then the Brexiteers or the Conservatives or Labour. You can go through all that, and they are, okay? But from our lofty perch here, it seems to be a constitutional democratic crisis because there was a vote. It's very clear, but the political class has failed to deliver.
Yeah, so, well, from my interpretation, Brexit kind of reflects a lot of the same problems they're having in the United States with Trump or across Europe, which is growing rift between the political establishment, which have committed themselves to certain political dogmas, and you have the population, which have been drifting further and further away from this. Now, I think the reason why Brexit fits within this theme is because the political elites never wanted to leave the EU, of course. There was David Cameron who gambled on it, but again, the first rule of gambling is, you shouldn't gamble if you can't afford to lose. But, he just wanted to bring the Conservative Party back in to get over this divisive element. But I think the problem they have now is that now they have to actually deliver Brexit. In short, they don't want to, and I guess that's
but okay, let me go to Annie. Annie, but it's completely, at least to me, it's completely transparent that they don't want to. They've invented things. They've gone back to procedural law and precedent. And they keep doing all of these things here. I mean, I'm a political junkie, like everyone else watching this program. But once I'm beginning to get confused, then I'm beginning to get worried because I mean, it's obviously. I mean, if you look at the Speaker of the House of Commons, I mean, he's obviously a remainder. I mean, there is no, he doesn't show any kind of dispassionate. I mean, he's the most passionate guy in the room most of the time, which I've never seen before. It's obvious the political class doesn't want to leave. And this is why I will not stop talking about the democratic deficit, because we have the European parliamentary elections coming up. And again, that issue of the deficit in democracy is going to be addressed. And I think people get this may be the one time they ever go out and vote, because people are getting more and more angry. The elites are not solving problems that people think need to be solved. Annie, go ahead.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think this was definitely a protest vote after years of blatant corruption that was never held accountable, most notably with the run-up to the Iraq War and the lies that were told to Parliament and to the people. Also, there was the MP's expenses scandal 10 years ago, which apparently has got worse since then. They haven't learned their lessons. So the disconnect, the democratic deficit, as you mentioned, has become a sort of gaping chasm in the UK at the moment. And the political elite will just not understand it. So David Cameron tried to tweak the system. He was rebuffed in Brussels, went back with no result when he tried to rejig the relationship in 2015, 2016. And suddenly, of course, he had to call a referendum, not really because he had any faith in democracy or the people or anything like that, but to try and merge the two antagonistic sides of the Conservative Party in the UK that had been at loggerheads since the 1980s. That's all he was trying to do. It had nothing to do with democracy. It had nothing to do with Europe. It was just trying to provide cohesion to his political party. The irony being, of course, that they got a result they completely did not expect. It was a protest vote. It was the biggest democratic vote in the entirety of UK history. And now it is being ignored. So it is sundering not only the Conservative Party in Parliament, it has broken the people's trust from whichever side, Remainer or Brexiteer, in the parliamentary process. I mean, the whole thing has been staged. The whole thing's been manipulated through the courts. There is a lot of anger. And I think it's only going to get worse. I mean, people keep talking about all the demonstrations on UK streets from one side or the other. And there's damn little coverage of the Gilets Jaunes demonstrations in France in the English-speaking media. That's actually far more important. And yet we still have Emmanuel Macron, the French president, lecturing Britain about the state of its democracy.
You know, Glenn, we have these European parliamentary elections coming up. I mean, what lessons are learned or not learned in watching this Brexit process? Because, you know, the way the Anglo-Saxon media is portrayed this is that, you know, it's Theresa May has been very strategic and tactful in dealing with Brussels, but Brussels is like a mailed fist, okay? They're making this really, really hard. And this is a message to everyone else in the European Union: don't mess with Brussels. And when you're in, it's Hotel California. Once you check in, you can never check out, and you will feel, I'm serious, you will feel the pain if you challenge the dictates coming out of Brussels.
Yeah, and Barnier, the negotiator on the EU side, he probably slip of the tongue, but he kind of revealed this in one of his interviews with a French paper as well, that that the outcome of the British election, essentially the negotiation, that had two purposes: one, to get a favourable agreement with the British, but the second would also be to deter anyone else from trying to follow this. So obviously this has affected the negotiation, that they can't. Well, if the British leave on good terms and end up doing better on the outside.
Do you think that'll be allowed, good terms? No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
It won't be, and I think what makes it even more problematic, as Serge correctly pointed out, they have the political elites in Britain have more or less been to some extent on the side of Brussels all along. They don't want to leave either. So what I found fascinating was, there's a lot of reasonable arguments both to stay in the EU and to leave, and this was all being debated up to the referendum. Now, after the referendum, the same debates continued, but now essentially, instead of being, you know, we have to compete for the people's voice, now the debate is whether or not the people voted wrong. And but both sides are doing this. So the opposition, they're saying, let's revoke Article 40, let's have a second referendum.
Why don't we just revoke the electorate? That would make it really simple, wouldn't it? Okay, let me go to Annie, because we're running out of time here. No, but I'm serious. I say that in tongue in cheek, but I think there's an element of truth to it. Annie, I think the biggest question I've had during this entire fiasco is that May was intended to do this all along, just wear everyone down with all the scaremongering as, you know, the cherry on top of the cake there. Is it possible? Because a lot of people tell me she isn't that bright and she wouldn't have been able to pull it off. Go ahead, Annie.
I think that people believed when David Cameron was scaremongering in the run-up to the referendum that if he lost, then he would immediately invoke Article 50, and then he just resigned. I mean, he ran away from the whole mess. And Theresa May really tried to pick up the pieces, and I'm not sure if she really had the momentum behind her, the will to enforce Brexit. She was a Remainer. So that's where a lot of this mess comes from. And then she dithered about invoking Article 50, and it allowed the EU to get their ducks in a row and put together the negotiating position and make sure all other 27 countries were aligned. So the UK went into it with a very poor hand anyway. And by taking away the option of no deal, she lost her key negotiating point. So it's been a mess every which way. But when it comes to referenda, I mean, let's not forget the Irish voted against the Maastricht Treaty, so did the Dutch, so did the Danish, and they were all told to go back and have another vote because they got the result wrong. That's what they're trying to do in the UK. So the notion that if your vote makes a difference, the politicians and the elite wouldn't allow it to happen, I think has been proven time and time again across the EU. And I think we're heading towards that situation yet again in the UK.
Yeah, but Annie, I'm going to stay with you here. There is a talk of the people's vote here. And doesn't that just send the message that you've just spoke about here, is that it's not really you have to have a process that gets the correct result according to Brussels. And so obviously in the case of Brexit, that didn't happen here. But doesn't it really lessen the value of elections themselves if you have to keep repeating them over and over again?
Absolutely. And it breaks the trust between the governed and the government. So this is a crisis I think we're going to see building across Europe, not just in the UK, but with other so-called populist movements. And the word populist is used as if it's an insult.
Yes.
In fact, surely that should just mean of the people.
Yeah, Glenn, I'm glad Annie says that, because, it's very difficult to define populism. It's more of a process. It is the activization of people here, because you can have populism all across the political spectrum here, but the media has demonized it as being fringe or alt, seditious even here. And I think, again, we have this kind of Trump effect. the more you insult the people, like the media did in Trump, the supporters of Trump, you know, the smelly Walmart people or Hillary Clinton's, the deplorables, the more you speak to people like that, the more they are willing to take a chance. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and well, that's effectively what defines populists often. They're willing to bring up the topics which the elites refuse to address. You know, sometimes the populists are good, sometimes bad, sometimes they have solutions, sometimes they don't. But you have to put into context of the post-Cold War system we've had. I mean, we have a few things we can't really challenge. So in Europe, it would be that the EU is the main format for organizing European affairs, but you also have neoliberal economics, you have mass migration, multiculturalism, and then you have the humanitarian and interventionism, and this general assumption you can solve everything with military. Now, when someone like the establishment can't really challenge any of these things, so that essentially leaves a huge growing scope for so-called populists to step in because they're willing to address this. I mean, if you remember, for example, Trump coming during the election, he would say things like, well, what's the point of NATO today? The Soviet Union is gone. Or why do we start new wars when you don't finish the old ones? It was treasonous. It was the most, how could he possibly say anything like this?
No, and the wall.
Yeah.
I mean, under the neoliberal system, you cannot defend your borders because defending your borders is defending your sovereignty, and sovereignty somehow is racist.
But it's not just on the right. Like in the US, you have people like Tulsi Gabbard now who comes up on the left saying, listen, maybe all these wars isn't a great idea, and now she's an apologist for Assad. She's a Russian agent. She's they already label her this thing. So I think that this is why you have the populists. They arrive at a vacuum.
Well, they say what's on a lot of people's minds. Okay, it goes back to the first part of the program here. When people start speaking their mind, there's people in power that want to limit that speech and narrow it here. That's all the time we have here.